Good evening, everyone. My name is Claire Alexander, and I'm Vice Chair of the Stuart Hall Foundation. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all here this evening. Those of you that are joining us for the third of our online programme of conversations under the banner #ReconstructionWork. Through the theme of Reconstruction work, which itself is taken from one of Stuart's essays, we explore the long histories of anti-racist activism and critical thinking and practice to help us construct more just and equal futures. As we all know, we're living through incredibly challenging times with the ongoing COVID crisis, continuing global protests around racial inequality and injustice, and the looming prospect of no-deal Brexit and the American elections. The questions of culture and identity, how these lead to political change, issues with which Stuart Hall's work was centrally concerned, have never been more important. The Black Lives Matter process in particular have shone a light on the ongoing struggle for recognition of Britain's Black and Brown communities and the ways in which our shared history continues to shape our unequal present. History has been placed front and centre in the recent declaration of the culture wars, from the toppling of statues to the singing, or not, of Rule Britannia. British history is and always has been a very contested arena, and it's been a key site of activism too, in schools, universities and communities for decades, and for white, Black and brown allies, whose history is told, whose history counts and why it matters, are now at the centre of public and political debate. Understanding our past and how it shapes our present is key to imagining a more equal future. This requires conversations across different generations, different communities, and different geographies. There's never been a better time to reimagine the society that we want to build based on equality and justice. This is the task of the Reconstruction work that we continue to do in our third conversation this evening. And we're very fortunate to have two guests who offer very different generational and geographical understandings of history and its role in decolonising education and imagining new futures. So our speakers this evening are Ruth Ramsden-Karelse, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Oxford and is the founder and co-convener of the Oxford Queer Studies Network. Ruth is the inaugural holder of the Stuart Hall Doctoral Studentship at Merton College and the Oxford Research Centre in the Humanities, TORG. Her research explores the world-making capacity of self-described gays and girls from communities formerly classified as coloured in Cape Town, South Africa from 1950 to the present. And some of her writings have been published in GLQ, a journal of gay and lesbian studies. Before starting her PhD, Ruth was a comprehensive school teacher in London. And Ruth will be in conversation with Professor Catherine Hall. And Catherine is the Emerita Professor of History and chair of the groundbreaking Centre for the Study of British Slave Ownership at UCL. She's a leading scholar of the history of Britain, gender and empire. She's author or editor of 8 books, including Civilising Subjects, Macaulay and Son, Architects of Imperial Britain, and with others, The Legacies of British Slave Ownership. From 2009 to 2016, she was the principal investigator on the Legacies of British Slave Ownership project. And she's currently writing a book on Edward Long, Jamaica and racial capitalism. Catherine is a trustee of the Stuart Hall Foundation and an associate editor of the History Workshop Journal. As in previous conversations, the format will be in 2 parts. A conversation between Ruth and Catherine, which will last about 30 minutes, followed by 25 minutes for questions. So for those of you who are in the Zoom room, you can ask these via the question and answer button at the bottom of your screen. So over to you, Ruth.
Thanks, Claire. Hi, I'm just waiting to see Catherine. Hi, Catherine.
Hello.
I'm very grateful to be having this discussion with you this evening and to be part of what's been a really brilliant series of conversations so far. As Claire mentioned, one of the events that we've been thinking about in the lead up to this discussion is the toppling of the statue of the slave trader Edward Colston in Bristol. and the kind of public conversation that's developed since, which has of course posed new challenges to the ways that we think about histories of slavery in Britain. So I know that you were working on the Legacies of British Slave Ownership project since 2009. So to start off with, can you take us back to the beginning of that project and speak a bit about how it evolved and what your journey was through the 10-year period?
Yes, and it's very good to be able to have this conversation with you, Ruth, and to think together about history, the different histories that we're each preoccupied with and their significance for the politics of social justice now. So the Slave Ownership Project started, as you said, in 2009, and it came out of a period of work before that, really connected with the whole recognition of Britain's position as a post-colonial sort of country and how that needed thinking about. And what that meant thinking about in part was connecting the history of empire with the history of Britain. And traditionally, those histories have been taught separately and written separately. So there was British history and there was imperial history. And it was like that for a very, very, very long time. So to insist on the connection was a very important break to make. And that was one part of what we were thinking about in the project, because we were making the argument from the beginning that the slavery business was very significant to Britain's history. Whereas, of course, traditionally it's been thought that what was really important was that Britain abolished slavery. But Britain abolished slavery after centuries of practicing slavery, albeit mostly in places far away from Britain. So that was part of what we were doing. But the other aspect of it was that we were really building on the very important arguments which Eric Williams, Trinidadian, made decades ago in his classic study of capitalism and slavery. And in that book, he argued that the wealth generated by slavery was very significant to the development of industrialization in Britain. So that Britain's wealth and power was very significantly connected to slavery. Now, that argument that he made had been denounced over generations, particularly by US historians, but also here. And we went back to it, wanting to reinvestigate it and see what the connections really might be. So those were the two kind of questions that we were addressing. And we chose to come at this through the question of slave ownership, because we wanted to show the ways in which Britons, ordinary men and women, some of them very wealthy, but many not, how they were involved in slavery. So the whole idea of the focus on white Britons and slave ownership was to show how Britain was involved in the slavery business.
Mm. So as you know, I'm originally from South Africa and I'm now living in Oxford, and the Rhodes Must Fall campaign here has kind of been recently reinvigorated after the toppling of the Colston statue. And this was a campaign that was originally inspired by the Rhodes Must Fall campaign at UCT. And of course, there were some activists involved in both. And these campaigns centered around the statue of Rhodes, but as a way of kind of insisting on highlighting the ways that colonial legacies continued to structure South Africa's present and Britain's present, and specifically the kind of university system. So I was thinking about this as you were speaking, about the idea that slavery is something that happened somewhere else in Britain, and that one of the obvious differences with these campaigns is that in South Africa that can't be a narrative. You know, colonialism happens, apartheid happens, there's more of an awareness of how this continues to structure the present. Whereas, you know, the whole time that I was at school in this country, as you say, I learned about abolition and Britain's role in abolition, but nothing about Britain's role in the actual business of slavery itself. So I mean, you've obviously been making this argument for a long time that these histories do matter here. And you've mentioned a few ways that you have made that argument, but I'd be interested in hearing more about that. And also about whether the responses to the project over the time you were doing it did change. Like, it seems to me at the moment, we're at this really significant moment where these things are being spoken about more, and there seems to be more of a commitment to speaking about it. Have you found that responses to the project have changed in that time, that you've had to make that argument less, that it's something that does matter here?
Well, I think both that things have changed, you're right, and that there's still a huge amount of work to do. And I suppose that I think one of the main effects of the way in which slavery was distanced from Britain, and this starts from the very beginning, that, you know, it's not happening here, it's happening over there. That's what I call distantiation, putting it at a distance. And I think that has enabled the denial of Britain's direct involvement in slavery. So I think denial or disavowal is absolutely central to the way in which it's been part of white British thinking that race has nothing to do with us. Race is what happens in the US, it's what happens in South Africa, it's what happens in the Caribbean, it's not here. And actually, race has always been here, you know, we know from the histories that have been done, Black people here in Roman times, etc., etc., etc. But particularly since the development of colonialism, the racialization of colonized populations has been absolutely central to how empires worked. So I think it's interesting, you know, when we first started making public the results of our project, I mean, there was a lot of, well, I suppose people just needed to think about it and needed to be convinced. And it is the case that some things have changed. So I think now, even in the mainstream press, that there is an understanding that abolition isn't the only thing to talk about in relation to slavery. And the idea of the significance of the compensation that was paid to slave owners seems to have entered into a more public discourse. And I think the taking down of the Colston statue is symbolic of a real change in the temperature on these matters. I mean, the Colston statue, as anybody in Bristol knows, has been argued about for a very, very long time, and has been a source of real conflict and contestation in Bristol. But of course, it became a national matter when it was so dramatically taken off its plinth. And what that meant, I think, has had a very important impact on getting people to think about statues more generally, about history and memory, about how slavery figures in all of that.
Did the response to the project, was there a heightened interest in the project after the moment of the toppling of the Colston statue?
There was indeed. It was absolutely extraordinary. In the days of the toppling and the days after, I mean, we normally get about 2,000 hits on our website a day. We were getting between 40 and 50,000 a day. People were coming to the website to look at the records, not just for compensation, which of course was what our first project was about, but the second phase of the project has been about British slave owners in the Caribbean between the mid-18th century and the time of emancipation. So there's actually an enormous amount of material on the website about slave ownership and Britain's involvement in it. And people are clearly very, very interested. And of course, we've got lots of evidence of the material being used in schools, being used in universities, being used by family historians. And one of the most important things about the project is that we now have more than 1,000 people who've contributed material to our database, so that it's not just the team who've been doing it, it is a genuinely public resource, and we're very proud of that.
Yeah, I was really excited to see there's guidance also on the website. There's like downloadable information, right? If people are wanting to do this research themselves, which looks like a really great resource.
Yeah, we make that possible, yeah.
So, I mean, you mentioned, as we know, there have always been historians who've kind of pointed out the ways that the legacies of slavery continue to structure Britain's present. And it does seem like you went into the project also trying to map this out and come up with more information. But I'm interested to know, is there anything that surprised you over the course of the project that you weren't expecting to find that came out?
Loads of things. And of course, that's partly what makes it so interesting. So, you know, we knew beforehand, and of course, historians had done work on the very significant, very wealthy people who got compensation, who they were, what they did politically, and so on. I mean, people like John Gladstone, William Gladstone's father, or Alderman Beckford, or, you know, a few people like that. But what we found is how there were slave owners right across England and Scotland, particularly, less in Wales and far less interestingly in Ireland. In Scotland, a disproportionate number of people. So that was one thing. And one of the things we've done is map all the people who we've got addresses for, so that, you know, this is one of the things that teachers really like, because, you know, in a school classroom, you can just take a look at Maidenhead and see, you know, who were the slave owners living near Maidenhead. And you'd be surprised. I mean, they're all over. So that's been very important. The other thing that's been very significant, I think, or one of the other very obvious things, is that they're not all wealthy, that there were quite a number of people, for example, widows living on annuities, which were, the annuity was actually funded by enslaved people being hired out in the Caribbean. So small scale slave owners who no doubt didn't think of themselves as slave owners at all, but actually they were beneficiaries of slavery. And then the other thing is the numbers of women, because I think we all have a picture, insofar as we have a picture of slave owners, they're likely to be men. And of course the majority were men, but about 25% of the women in Britain who got compensation, of the people in Britain who got compensation, were women. And in the Caribbean, more than 40% of those who got compensation were women. And of course, quite a large number of those women were women of color. So it complicates the whole question of race and the legacies of racialization, which of course is absolutely central to what we're thinking about.
So, yeah, because you're speaking about individuals, women, people, you know, it's a kind of, we're not only thinking of like very elite white men, and it does strike me that we both think about this, I don't know what to call it, like the personal, intimate kind of histories in both of our work as a way into thinking about kind of broader historical patterns. So in my own work, I write about someone who identified as gay herself. She might now be read by people as either trans or queer. And she was part of a community that was classified coloured in apartheid South Africa that was forcibly removed from their homes in Cape Town. And I myself come from a family that was classified coloured and that was also forcibly removed from their homes in Cape Town. And I also identify as gay. So there's ways that I feel very like personally invested in this work, but I'm also obviously writing about it at a kind of huge remove. So I'm in the UK, I'm often read as white and straight, I'm doing my PhD at Oxford, so it's really like a massive difference from the actual material conditions that I'm writing about. And this balance between a kind of or a tension, I guess, it's been a productive tension for me between a kind of personal investment, but also an inescapable awareness of my own distance from what I'm working on, and that's been very important to me. So given these kind of similarities I've been thinking about in our work, I'd be really interested to hear more about how you've navigated and thought about your own positionality in relation to your work, and also this idea of using intimate individual personal histories as a way into thinking about larger histories.
I think you said loads of interesting things there, actually. Well, let me start by saying that you know, I mean, I grew up in a radical white nonconformist family, and I came to politics through that. But then I really grew up politically through feminism, and so an understanding of, you know, all my original work was about gender and class. And then in the context of the women's movement, I was very involved in a journal called Feminist Review, which is still a flourishing feminist journal. And we had lots and lots of arguments and conflicts and contestation on Feminist Review about the relation between black and white feminists in the 80s. And it was really at that time, in the context of a new race politics, the race politics of Britain in the 80s, that I really seriously became aware of my own situation as a white woman and what that meant and what white privilege was about, and how, so for me, that became the crucial reason why I wanted to engage in a different kind of British history, a different kind of writing about British history, which would be an exploration of the patterns of race within that. So, and knowing that I was doing it, I mean, I do profoundly believe that, you know, the past lives on in the present, and that in the present we're always negotiating with the past. And so that exploration of the persistence of patterns of racialization, but also, of course, the changes and shifts. It's not always the same. Racism doesn't, you know, it's not always practiced in the same ways. There are shifts and changes. And so now, working on the 18th century, I've had to, you know, first of all, I was working on the 19th century. It's different from the 18th century, but I've been working on the Caribbean for a long time. But all that exploration of the organization of the ways in which racial thinking became part of English culture, that's really been at the heart of what I've been interested in doing. And then the point that you make, that I am also really interested in, about how to, you know, what kinds of histories we both write, and how we're both interested in using individual stories as ways into systemic patterns of inequality and questions of social and economic and political structure. So I've found that a very satisfying way to work. And I think that takes me right back to my feminism, because I've always thought that the relation between the public and the private is, you know, very, very intimate. And so I'm interested in how people live race, how they live gender, how they experience the structures in which they are, and also what forms of, what kinds of agency individuals do have, so that we're not simply, you know, we're not produced by the structures we live in, but we have to live in those structures and work with those structures, but we can do things with them. And that's part of having hope politically, that, you know, there is space for change.
Yeah, that really resonates a lot with me. I guess specifically in the UK, I can imagine it's been difficult. Like, I know that with the project, public engagement has always been really crucial. It's a really interesting kind of model, I guess, of a collaborative project. And, you know, from listening to podcasts and stuff, some of them some of which you're on, it becomes really obvious that anyone who does this kind of history and who is, you know, talking about histories of trauma and violence and exploitation is very readily accused of having a kind of partial agenda, of being partisan, of attacking a narrative that of course is a completely subjective narrative, but it's been established as a kind of objective, you know, the golden thread of British history, like a top-down version, facts, facts, facts. Yeah, so I guess I've been wondering what balance looks like with histories like this, whether we should be seeking balance, you know, whether it seems to me that discussing the pros and cons of empire, for example, which is an alarmingly common way of it being taught in schools, is just completely bizarre, because I mean, how are you weighing up the pros and cons for whom? It's not got it's no kind of understanding of human cost involved, and who are the winners and losers in each situation. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on what balance looks like with this, and whether we should actually be aiming for balance at all, or whether that's a kind of ideology that is used to stop these histories from being discussed and taught.
Well, I'm certainly not aiming for balance. I'm aiming to get as close as I can to an understanding of how individuals and societies worked in the past. I mean, I suppose that's what I'm trying to do, which will always be through the prism of the present, because I live in the present. And so, you know, the idea that historians are objective, I don't believe in. And I know that I'm attacked for that, and fine, you know, that's absolutely fine. I'm not trying to defend it as objective, but that doesn't mean that I'm not trying to understand the materials I use, the documents I use, the archives I use, as best I can, and test them against other kinds of materials, and try and understand how things work. Not simply, I mean, obviously not just trying to put my own pattern on things, but trying to understand what's actually going on, and looking at a whole range of sources to do that. And of course, one of the things that's sort of, you know, what I've chosen to work on in this current period is I'm working on a very well-known slave owner and racist called Edward Long. And some people would think, you know, why on earth do you want to work on somebody like that? I want to work on him because I want to understand how he understood Jamaican society and English society in the 18th century, and also how he was one of the architects of the making of race, of the new forms of racialization in Jamaica in the 18th century. And indeed, he was building on what his father and grandfather had done before him. So they're like architects of colonialism in the Jamaican context.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So it's about, I mean, one of the things I really liked about the Legacies of British Slave Ownership project is the different legacies that you look at. And I think it's great. There's like a drop-down menu, and there's commercial legacies, political legacies, cultural legacies. So thinking about legacies in terms of the ways that we think in kind of less material, tangible, you know, physical objects. I mean, one of the things that I think about in my work, I guess, that relates to ideas and the ways that ideas travel through time and inform the present is, so I think about the ways that kind of labour gets erased in the materials that I work with. So I work with mainly a collection of photographs taken by this community that I spoke about. And I think about the ways that a kind of product of labour is used to advocate for certain political agendas. So in South Africa, you know, in the moment, at the beginning of the democratic era, there's ideologies of like rainbowism and narratives of progress and inclusivity, and a very specific kind of neoliberal gay rights agenda. And some of the producers of the culture that I talk about are kind of taken up and used to advocate for that agenda that doesn't recognise them in the ways that they're being asked to be recognised themselves. So it's always been really important to me to return to what the producers of this culture are themselves saying and asking for, and the ways that the histories actually, or the dynamics that they're contesting at the time, continue to repeat in the present. So for example, the area that they're being forcibly removed from, people are still being forcibly removed from, and it's not because of apartheid policy, but it's because of gentrification and anti-poor laws. So for me, that the insisting on going back to what they're saying about themselves, for example, can feel like really like moving against the grain, like swimming against the tide, because everything that's been said about them kind of goes against that. And I guess it's kind of inverse in a way of what you're talking about, thinking about Edward Long and the ways that the ideas that he is really fundamental in establishing continues to shape the present, so the histories that he was writing, for example. I was very interested to read you discuss that work as like a form of reparation, as a kind of reparative way of doing history. And do you think you could unpack that for us a bit?
Well, first of all, I think it's really interesting what you said about labour and the erasure of labour, because I think this is, this gets repeated again and again and again. So one of the ways, Edward Long writes extensively about the plantation and the organisation of the plantation, but he writes all the time erasing the work of the enslaved, the people who are actually hoeing the ground, planting the seed, cutting the cane. He talks about it all in the passive voice, as if it just gets done. And the most important part of it for him is the work that he does, which is the thinking work, which is the planning, the organization of it all, the management of it all, so that the actual physical labor of these thousands of people who are being, in effect, worked to death on these plantations, it just disappears from his text. And I think that's, I think that the disappearance of labor, the erasure of labor in so much history writing is really, really important, and something that it's absolutely vital to get back to. And of course, one of the good things about how historical work has changed in these last decades is that, things like oral history have made a big difference to what we can get at in the past, and new kinds of sources or digital sources. What we've been able to do because we've got computers and collaboration and a team, that we can open up a history that it just wasn't possible to open up before. And what we hope to go in the next phase of our work with the project is to work on the lives of the enslaved through what are called the slave registers, which are the censuses that were taken of enslaved people in the decades before emancipation, which give us access to the lives of the enslaved in a way that's absolutely unique. So that will just open up a different set of possibilities for exploration and discovery. All part of Reconstruction, one could say.
I'm interested in this idea of language and the language. You're talking about the kind of erasure of labour, and I think right at the beginning of the book that came out of the project, you say the language that we use to discuss slave owners now was established by the slave owners themselves, that they found ways to talk about owning humans without talking about owning humans. And the fact that we continue to do this is one really clear way of how they kind of ideologically continue to inform the present. And I was also interested in the shift that the project's trying to make of language from perpetrators to beneficiaries. And I which I know has kind of been done successfully in post-war Germany, for example. And I'm wondering around this question of reparations. I've been thinking personally myself, I think many of us have become incredibly frustrated with this, the kind of like performative kind of allyship that's emerged, particularly on social media recently, that shows how easy it is for people to center themselves, you know, in and think about, I guess, capital very simplistically in terms of like saying, you know, I made X donation and like that's the work done. And I was wondering, I mean, I'm in English, so maybe I just overthink language, but I was wondering whether the language of allyship, although the concept remains like crucial, I was wondering whether the language is perhaps enables that kind of centering in a way that a language of reparations or reparative work might avoid or help us avoid. What do you think?
I'm not sure, but I do want to say something about language, which, you know, you put very clearly in my head, which is that one of the things that's fascinating about, I'm back to Edward Long, I'm afraid, is that he is absolutely explicit about the importance of whiteness and talks about himself as white and talks about white people as white with a capital W. And he posits whiteness against, they try not to talk about slaves, or they certainly don't talk about enslaved people. They talk about Negroes. So they use the term Negro to avoid using the term slave. So it's whites and Negroes. But I find this fascinating because one of the things that's so commonly said now about whiteness is how it disappears, how, because it's the norm, nobody has to speak it. But in the colonial situation, they did speak it very, very explicitly. And that enables you to see how forms of racialization are actually being made at that time. They have to be specific, that white skin makes, you know, the difference. You're free because you're white. You're enslaved because you're black, because you're Negro. So anyway, I think reparation, I mean, I think that a first step in making possible repair insofar as we can of what's happened in the past is understanding and knowing. And until we break the patterns of denial, until it's recognized, until responsibilities are recognized, until people grasp the extent to which people in Britain have been beneficiaries of not just slavery, but of empire altogether, how, you know, imperial poverty has made Britons wealthy. And therefore, you know, the deep inequalities that go back so far and that need to be repaired.
There's so much more to say about this, but I'm aware that we're about to run out of time. So I'm just going to try and squeeze in one more question before we move to the Q&A. So for those of you joining us, please do send through any questions that you might have using the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom window. But before we move to the questions, you know, we're doing this event for the Stuart Hall Foundation. So I thought I'd take the opportunity to ask you something, Catherine, that I'd be interested in hearing about. In Familiar Stranger, Stuart Hall's memoir, he writes about you, even when we are not actually speaking, I'm in perpetual conversation with her and have been for years, which is a really beautiful reference also to the impact that your work and thinking had on his own. And I know he speaks about that and writes about that elsewhere as well, and particularly the challenge posed by your involvement in the feminist movement and feminist ways of doing history. So I'd be really interested to hear if you'd be willing to speak about your perspective on that, whether how you felt that your work was in conversation with his or shaped by his or vice versa.
Well, it makes me a little bit weepy, but yes, it was a lifelong conversation, and the thing is, it hasn't stopped. Because although I don't believe in ghosts, as Hilary Mantel does, she really, really does believe in ghosts. I don't believe in ghosts, but I do believe that the that the dead live on in us. And so, you know, sometimes I just wish Stuart would speak to me a bit more clearly. But it's very, very important that his ideas, that I remain in conversation with them. And of course, the book about Edward Long and Jamaica is absolutely in conversation with Stuart. So, I mean, in the early days when we were together, I think, you know, I was much less, our paths were much more separate. But the minute I began to work on Jamaica and colonialism, which I did in the late 80s, from then on, it was just so important that it was a joint exploration. And he was pursuing, you know, always trying to understand the present, writing the history of the present. I was writing the history of the past through the present. So it was a very rich conversation that we were able to have. And some of the most wonderful times that we had together were also in Jamaica, where, you know, he came with me and we went exploring in Jamaica, and that was just so memorable and took him, you know, he was a middle-class Kingston boy and he'd never been up into the hills and seen what I wanted to see, and which he then was able to discover. So, I mean, I learned so much from him, but as he would say, he also did learn from me.
Thank you. I'll move on to the questions now. So, the first question we have is, thanks very much to Professor Catherine Hall for creating this world-changing website. And the question for you, Catherine, is, do you support the call for reparations for slavery as presented by Professor Hilary Beckles of UWI?
I'm a historian, and I think that the most important work that I can do is in this, how I've been talking about it, trying to understand the past. I absolutely am in agreement that there should be reparation from European states, and that it should go into Caribbean infrastructure particularly. I think that's terribly important. I also think that the work that universities do is very important, and that, you know, I mean, first and foremost, universities need to decolonise their own syllabuses, which obviously is now very much under discussion, and is crucial to the development of a different kind of understanding of British and imperial history for everyone.
Thanks. I'll try and get in as many as possible. So, another question: the public debate about race and history is opening up in Britain, precisely as the humanities/history space in universities is shrinking, and dramatically in the face of COVID. In a context where at times simplified, essentialized narratives about race and identity are taking hold, where else, apart from the university classroom, do you see as spaces for intellectual projects about race and empire that make space for complicated narratives about our shared histories?
Well, I suppose all the different forms of public engagement that can be. One of the things I've been looking at recently is, you know, I mean, obviously, artists have been contributing hugely to all these debates. And I was looking at Hugh Locke's website and thinking about his work and thinking about what he's done. And one of the projects he did was at Runnymede, and he created these chairs in the, you know, the area where Magna Carta was debated and signed, for people to sit on and think about and discuss questions of social justice and human rights. And I think, you know, that's, you know, a completely different kind of way of thinking about a public conversation about social justice than thinking about the classroom, or thinking about what can be done on television, or thinking about music. I mean, all these different ways in which ideas circulate and can circulate, and that, you know, we all hopefully can contribute in whatever there are particular ways that we're interested and feel we have something to offer.
Thanks. Another question I have. I wonder when the concept race emerged and whether it was part of colonial expansion and a perceived Darwinism of superiority of one social group, the white European male, as part of enlightenment of science.
Well, I think it's a lot older than that. And obviously the particular moment that I'm interested in is the 17th and 18th century and in the colonial context. But I think, you know, many people would argue, as Cedric Robinson does in his book Black Marxism, that there's a longer history in European forms of racialization, and that the development of European forms of racialization that go along with in the period of the decline of feudalism and the development of capitalism are absolutely crucial. I think what's really important is to try to understand the different temporalities and different spatialities in which racial thinking takes place and racial hierarchies are created. And I think that it's the specificity that is so interesting and important, really. Inequality gets reproduced again and again and again, but in slightly different ways, in slightly different patterns, in relation to slightly different populations. And what you were saying earlier, Ruth, about the difference between South Africa and Britain brings that up so clearly. Or we can think about the Caribbean and Britain, and then we could think about the Irish in Britain, which is, you know, another whole set of practices of racialization that are different from what happens in relation to people of color, and so on. So I think, although racial inequalities continue and continue and continue, I think understanding their historical specificity into the present is absolutely vital.
Thanks. We had one question through about me. The question is, what qualifies Ruth above Black British academics to partake in this discussion? Catherine, I totally get based on her excellent work in this area, but it seems like the endorsement and the perpetuation of a person of colour representation that stymies the growth of Black scholarship. Yeah, I mean, that's a really important question. I don't think that I'm qualified at all above Black British academics to partake in this discussion, absolutely. And I completely share your concern about a kind of BAME rhetoric that actually enables a kind of anti-Blackness, because we're counting numbers and not including Black people within that number. You know, and as I said, I'm completely aware that although I am mixed race, that I in many ways move through the world as a white person. But I do feel very strongly that we need to, you know, non-Black people of colour and white people do, of course, also need to be thinking and talking about the constructions of race. And yeah, also very much I admire, yeah, I also, anyway, maybe I'll stop there. I could talk a lot about this, but thank you for the question. And I absolutely don't think that I'm qualified above any Black British academics to partake in this discussion.
Yeah, but you're qualified as somebody coming from South Africa who's working on important questions. And that's why we're having this conversation.
Thanks, Catherine. It was very interesting to me anyway. Okay, I'll move on to the next question. I'd love to hear Catherine say more about the distinction between perpetrator and beneficiary and what the implications of this distinction might be.
That's, you know, these are all important and interesting questions. I mean, I think that the where that debate really developed was in Germany in the period after the war, and realizing that the focus on perpetrators, always thinking about that, was actually leading people to forget all the other kinds of ways in which people were involved, though perhaps not directly. You know, they weren't guards in concentration camps, but on the other hand, they were living in streets where they were seeing Jewish people being taken away to concentration camps, and they weren't stopping them. So, you know, it's the bystanders who are also necessarily implicated. We're all implicated in these systems in different ways. And it's really that recognition that I think is so important. The idea of, there's an American critic called Michael Rothberg who talks about the notion of being implicated subjects. So, you know, when I say that people in Britain have benefited from, they are more wealthy, they are healthier, they are have had more access to education, etc., because of living in this society, which has outsourced and exploited in other societies, which is not to say at all that exploitation hasn't happened here too, but it's happened in different ways here from the ways in which it happened across the empire. So it's that sense of everybody being part of it, and really wanting to argue for history being a history for all of us. It's not for victims, it's not just for victims and perpetrators, it's for everyone who survives in these systems. It's about the system and how power operates in those systems, and how we might begin to be able to think about that differently.
Given that the Legacies of Slave Ownership website has had so many thousands of hits per day since the BLM protests, I'm interested in its huge potential to change the national narrative in relation to white denial in a more formal way, within formal education, for example. Is this something your team has considered, Catherine?
Well, we've always worked as much as we could with all these, you know, many different forms of public engagement, and one of them, of course, is working with teachers, and which we continue to do. And there's just so much that can be done. And, you know, currently our team is very small and very under-resourced. So all these things, we have loads of things we'd like to do, and we can only do them in collaboration with other people. And of course, lots of other people have been working on connected issues for a very long time. It's not like we're struggling alone. You know, there's a whole generations of people who've been trying to rethink histories and trying to tackle racism and social injustice. So it's thinking of ourselves as part of that bigger project, and trying to find the ways we can of working together with, whether it's teachers or artists or television documentary makers or radio producers or whoever, you know, all the different ways, or fiction writers. I mean, I think fiction's been so important in helping to help people think differently about race, about migration, about Britain. But, you know, we're faced with resurgent English nationalism, which is a pretty uncomfortable situation. So although, you know, we're happy that the project has had an impact, my goodness me, there's so much that all of us need to do and need to continue working on to try and tackle the resurgence of English nationalism. And I mean, it's interesting because at the beginning, Claire mentioned the culture wars and the you know, the Rule Britannia thing. Well, of course, the people like Boris Johnson who are arguing that we all ought to be singing Rule Britannia as a form of English nationalism, little do they realise that Rule Britannia was written as a rejection of authoritarian monarchs, and that, you know, what it's claiming is that liberty-loving Britons won't have any of this authoritarianism. So, you know, tell that to Boris Johnson.
Yeah. Although I wonder also with the Rule Britannia kind of controversy, whether it just seems like a very clever way to like discredit Black Lives Matter activists, for example. Like, I haven't seen any activists actually arguing that we shouldn't be singing Rule Britannia, but I've seen a lot of you know, liberals and conservatives get very outraged about the fact that supposedly people are saying this, and precisely because we can go back and say, oh, you know, it's not actually about this. It just seems like a kind of straw man, I don't know if that's the right term in this context, but a way to create outrage out of nothing.
Absolutely, I quite agree with you, but of course it's also a way of battering the BBC, which is politically a lot of what it's about. But it was the same with the whole thing about the Churchill statue. Nobody was suggesting they were going to top the Churchill statue. I mean, it's an invented fear. It's a fake story that stirs up white fears and white terrors in a very damaging way.
I completely agree. Sorry, I'm going to get back to the questions. In a reaction, I think we have just a few minutes left, so please do send in any other questions that you have after this one. In a reactionary media climate dominated by right-wing media, how can we carve out space for nuance in public debate on issues of colonialism and empire?
Well, I suppose in all the sort of different ways that you know, we've been pondering over. So, you know, I mean, things are it's so hard in this particular time with the pandemic, when sources of, you know, public spaces are so threatened and it's so difficult. And Zooms are all very well, but, you know, it's not the same as talking to people in person. It's very, very different from talking to people in person. So I really miss, you know, meeting and talking and sharing. But I think that, you know, actually we have to keep going. We have to keep going in whatever spaces we are in. I mean, if you're a student there in your classes, if you're a librarian, keeping the libraries open because books are so absolutely vital. If you're in politics, then arguing directly in the political parties and so on and so forth. I mean, everywhere we just have to keep going in whichever spaces we're in and trying to open up public debate in whatever ways we can.
Yeah, I always return to, I think it was Stuart Hall's, I think it was the cultural studies and its theoretical legacies, possibly. I think it was a talk that he gave originally where he asks, he says, you know, he's talking about the AIDS crisis specifically, and he says, you know, you might ask, what's the point in cultural studies? And if you don't feel that kind of urgency, then what are you doing? But I just think it's a really like inspiring description of doing the bit with what you're doing, that I find, yeah, helpful in relation to that.
Mm-hmm.
So,
doing the bit in whatever space you're in, really.
Yeah, exactly.
Which takes us back to, you know, just our politics being always connected with ourselves, who we are, how we position ourselves, how we try and behave in the world, all those things.
I've just seen a message that we need to wrap this up, unfortunately. So yeah, I'll just say thank you so much, Catherine, for the conversation, and thank you so much everyone for joining us. And I'll hand back over to Claire.
Thank you, Ruth.
Hi everyone. firstly, let me just say, I think we might have had a bit of a technical glitch at the beginning of this. So if you did join us late for the live stream and missed the first few minutes, the whole event is recorded and will be available online so you can see the bits you missed. Secondly, I want to thank Ruth and Catherine for an incredibly timely, thoughtful and really moving conversation. And all of you for really thoughtful and challenging questions. A few announcements before we finish. First, to say that our second Stuart Hall Fellow in Oxford, Caetano Santos, will be staging an Instagram takeover, looking at some of the issues raised tonight in a different geographical context, looking at his work on Haiti and Brazil. Second, we're really excited to announce a forthcoming event with Angela Davis, which will take place on the 17th of September. And this online event is being held in partnership with the South Bank Centre. So tickets go on sale for that. If you're not a member of the South Bank Centre, tickets go on sale on Monday the 7th. Thirdly, we'll be holding an ongoing series of these conversations in relation to the Reconstruction Work Programme. So do please sign up if you haven't done for our mailing list or social media to keep informed. So one of the key roles for the Stuart Hall Foundation is to create platforms for these kinds of conversations, to provide space for discussion, debate, dialogue, to generate critical thinking, to bend the twig, as Stuart was very fond of saying. So finding new ways of thinking and acting, imagining new futures. We do this through our talks and our events, and by building a growing network of Stuart Hall scholars and fellows, activists and artists in residence. The foundation was established 5 years ago and is inspired and animated by the life and work of Professor Stuart Hall. We are a small charity, but we have big ambitions. We're committed to public education, as Stuart was, and in particular to addressing urgent questions of race and ethnicity and inequality in culture and in society. So if you value our work, and I hope you do, then please support us and make a donation to the foundation. We recently launched a crowdfunding campaign to help us continue to provide access to everyone for the Reconstruction Work Programme and to develop an expanded digital platform. And you can find details of how to do this on the Stuart Hall Foundation website. So do please visit and contribute whatever you can to support our work. So thank you everyone, Catherine, Ruth, everyone who came. Enjoy the rest of your evenings.